Good afternoon, class. In today's video, what I'd like to do is to continue the series of chess. We're going to start with a little bit of openings, but before I get into going over specific types of openings, what I thought I'd do is first show a video on influence. And I'm using these pieces of paper as a marker of the influence that is on each of the pieces of the board right now. So as you can see right here in the middle, there is no influence. Before we've even started the game, there is no influence in these rows 4 and 5, nothing. However, there is a bit of influence here on the 3rd row and on the 6th row. The other thing I wanted to point out was, if you'll notice, there are certain squares that actually have more influence on them at this point, and that would be F3, so right over here. This square has actually the most influence right now because it has this pawn being able to capture here, this pawn being able to capture here, and this knight being able to capture over here. Same thing over here on C3. You have knight, pawn, and pawn. That's why there are three pieces of paper on this square. So what I thought I'd do, before we go over specific openings and their advantages and disadvantages, what I thought I'd do is feature what happens when you start just any opening. And I'm going to start this time with basically the Roy Lopez opening. So it's going to be E4 and E5. Now the thing is, things change a little bit when you've done this. Now you've got the pawn's influence over here, and this pawn's influence right over here. You've also gained some influence right over here. Now notice I put there's red over here. Now there's the yellow piece of paper along with 2 of the purple pieces, right? So the knight still has influence here, and this pawn has influence here. However, this bishop now is starting to exert influence on this square. However, this is a losing position for this bishop to ever come over here right away. That is a terrible idea because there's 2 pieces that are going to capture it. So we don't worry about that right now. But as you can see, and of course I did that for black, I should also do that for white. As you can see, with just move number 1, the influence on the board is already immense. Like immense. I cannot even begin to describe how much greater the influence has gone right now. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move out to, oh, I'm sorry. And I also almost forgot about the queen. The queen's influence here. And the queen's influence out here. So the amount of influence that is coming out over here is quite large. In fact, you'll even notice right over here and right over here, there's even influence over on this part as well. So this part of the board starts to be what we call covered. So now that we've gotten to this point, now notice the only places with no influence are these 2 squares right here on the A column, just from the first move alone. Now let's move on to the second move. Let's say we do something like, if we're following the typical Roy Lopez opening, which, by the way, does not always have to, you don't have to follow this. This is just an example of that, just to show influence right now. Right now I've got my knight over here. This has actually changed things quite a bit because now I have influence here, 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 and I still have influence right over here and over here coming from the rook and the knight. So, oh, and I apologize. There's actually a 3rd piece with the king. The king actually does have his own influence on this square as well. And so does this king right over here. Although this one actually is a little bit different because the knight hasn't moved out yet. So there's actually 4 pieces on this square right here. So now what we can see is this pawn is under the influence of this knight because there is one of those purple influence pieces right over here. This makes the pawn under threat. So now the question becomes, what are we going to do about that? Because that's one of the questions I like to ask myself. It's not so far about influence on the board right now. The main thing when you start moving, the first question you should ask before you, especially if you're black right now, right? White made this move. Now there's some influence here. We're not worried too much about what's going to happen over here. What we are worried about is the fact that this pawn is being threatened now, and there are no pieces, there are no influence, there's no influence over here that will help protect this pawn. So a lot of times people, what black will do in this typical scenario is to move their knight out here. This puts some influence back here, an extra bit of influence here, 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 2 more bits of influence over here, and actually 1 more bit of influence right here in the middle. So as you can see, 2 moves in, already the amount of influence on this board is already actually quite massive. Probably surprising in how much influence there is all around the board at this point. 2 moves in. Again, let me repeat that. 2 moves in. So what happens as we go through more and more of these? Or what if I chose a different opening? You can actually see that kind of influence develop just from this motion alone. In fact, let's stick with the final piece of the Roy Lopez opening. We put our bishop here as at least, and I don't mean this to be as, this is like the final version of the Roy Lopez. What I mean is this is the typical starting point of what you would call the Roy Lopez. You can have other variations. There are other openings out there, but this is probably the most commonly played one. And as you can see, just two and a half moves in, the whole board is now covered in influence. So what I thought I'd do is keep that as a, use this, I wanted to use this as a lesson, I use these pieces as a lesson to show within the first 2 moves of the game, you basically spread your influence almost across the entire board, and territory is actually going to matter, right? In fact, yes, so all of these territories are actually contested at this point. You basically are white in this 3rd move is already starting to creep in over and across the 5th row, going into the enemy or the opponent's territory. Black has kind of done that a little bit over here as well, but not as much because black has not responded. But as you can see, the amount of influence just by opening up pieces is immense. There is an immense amount of influence and potential for conflicts all across the board. So this is what makes chess somewhat fast-paced, especially if you know what you're doing and you know what to look for. And especially if you can, because while this right here may be a little bit distracting, you might look at this and say, that's a lot of pieces of paper on the board, which is fair enough. It just hopefully gives you an idea that there is a lot going on within every single move of chess. And as pieces get captured, as pieces open up, as pieces move, influence changes, and those those influence types of moves, or basically what I like to call territorial claims, like over here with the pawn, these are going to get more and more important as the position changes, as pieces get captured, as the game evolves. You're going to start getting a lot more influence in different areas. So I thought I'd feature that in this case. What I'll do as we move forward is I'll try to use different ones. This is the Roy Lopez. I might do some more modern openings in the future, but basically I'm going to be trying to show how influence can spread across the board using some of these openings. So study hard, and I'll see you in the next video.